Me versus We, The Battle for America's Soul, by Thom Hartmann. Here's what the Vedas say about the concept of I, me, and mine. From Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 9, Text 3. Yadhi vavamahamnisve parasmin kalamayayo rameta gata samohas tvakvodaste tabhodbayam. Synonyms: Yarhi, at any time; Vava, certainly; Mahimni, in the glory; Sve, of himself; Parasmin, in the supreme; Kala, time; Mayayo, of the material energy; Rameta, enjoys; Gata samoha, being freed from the misconception; Tyaktva, giving up; Udaste, in fullness; Tada, then; Ubhayam, both the misconceptions of I and mine. Translation: as soon as the living entity becomes situated in his constitutional glory and begins to enjoy transcendence beyond time and material energy, he at once gives up the two misconceptions of life, I and mine, and thus becomes fully manifested as the pure self. Purport: the two misconceptions of life, namely, I and mine, are verily manifested in two classes of men. In the lower state, the conception of mine is very prominent, and in the higher state, the misconception of I is prominent. In the animal state of life, the misconception of mine is perceivable even in the category of cats and dogs, who fight with one another with the same misconception of mine. In the lower stages of human life, the same misconception is also prominent in the shape of, it is my body, it is my house, it's my family, it's my caste, it's my nation, it's my country, and so on. In the higher stage of speculative knowledge, the same misconception of mine is transformed into I am, or it is all I am, and etc. There are many classes of men comprehending the same misconception of I and mine in different colors, but the real significance of I can be realized only when one is situated in the consciousness of, quote, I am the eternal servitor of the Lord, end quote. This is pure consciousness, and the whole Vedic literatures teach us this conception of life. The misconceptions of I am the Lord, or I am the Supreme, is more dangerous than the misconception of mine. Although there are some directions in the Vedic literatures to think of oneself one with the Lord, that does not mean that one becomes identical with the Lord in every respect. Undoubtedly, there is oneness of the living entities with the Lord in many respects, but ultimately the living entity is subordinate to the Lord, and he is constitutionally meant for satisfying the senses of the Lord. The Lord therefore asks the conditioned souls to surrender unto him. Had the living entities not been subordinate to the supreme will, why would the living entity be asked to surrender? Had the living being been equal in all respects, then why was he put under the influence of Maya? We have already discussed many times that the material energy is controlled by the Lord. The Bhagavad Gita 9.10 confirms this controlling power of the Lord over the material nature. Can a living entity who claims to be as good as the Supreme Being control the material nature? The foolish I would reply that he will do so in the future. Accepting that in the future one will be as good a controller of material nature as the Supreme Being, then why is one now under the control of material nature? The Bhagavad Gita says that one can be freed from the control of material nature by surrendering unto the Supreme Lord. But if there is no surrender, then the living entity will never be able to control the material nature. So one must also give up this misconception of I by practicing the way of devotional service, or firmly being situated in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. A poor man without any employment or occupation may undergo so many troubles in life, but if by chance the same man gets a good service under the government, he at once becomes happy. There is no profit in denying the supremacy of the Lord, who is the controller of all energies, But one should be constitutionally situated in one's own glory, namely to be situated in the pure consciousness of being the eternal servant of the Lord. In his conditional life, the living entity is a servant of the illusory Maya, and in his liberated state, he is the pure, unqualified servant of the Lord. To become untinged by the modes of material nature is the qualification for entering into the service of the Lord. As long as one is a servant of mental concoctions, one cannot be completely free from the disease of I and mine. The Supreme Truth is uncontaminated by the illusory energy because he is the controller of that energy. The relative truths are apt to be engrossed in illusory energy. The best purpose is served, however, when one is directly facing the Supreme Truth, as when one faces the sun. The sun overhead in the sky is full of light, but when the sun is not visible in the visible sky, all is darkness. Similarly, when one is face to face with the Supreme Lord, he is free from all illusions, and one who is not so is in the darkness of illusory Maya. The Bhagavad Gita 14:26 confirms this as follows: Mam chiyo vyabhichare na bhakti yogena sevate, sagunan samatityaitan, brahma bhuyaya kalpate. So, the science of bhakti yoga, of worshiping the Lord, glorifying the Lord, hearing the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam from the right sources, not from the professional man, but from a person who is Bhagavatam in life, and being always in the association of pure devotees, should be adopted in earnestness. One should not be misled by misconceptions of I and mine. The karmis are fond of this conception of mine. The jnanis are fond of the conception of I, and both of them are unqualified to be freed from the bondage of the illusory energy. Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam and primarily the Bhagavad Gita are both meant for delivering a person from the misconception of I and mine, and Srila Vyasadeva transcribed them for the deliverance of all the fallen souls. The living entity has to be situated in the transcendental position where there is no more influence of time nor the material energy. The conditional life of the living entity is subjected to the influence of time in the dream of past, present, and future. The mental speculator tries to conquer the influence of time by future speculations of becoming Vasudeva or the Supreme Lord himself by means of culturing knowledge or conquering over ego. But the process is not perfect. The perfect process is to accept Lord Vasudeva as the supreme in everything, and the best perfection in culturing knowledge is to surrender unto him, because he is the source of everything. Only in that conception can one get rid of the misconception of I and mine. Both Bhagavad Gita and the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam confirm it. Srila Vyasadeva has specifically contributed to the illusioned living entities the science of God and the process of bhakti yoga in his great literature, Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, and the conditioned soul should fully take advantage of this great science. The following is Thom Hartmann's article, Me versus We, The Battle for America's Soul. From greedy kings to corporate conglomerates, it's always been the same fight. Yesterday, I wrote about how the mental illness of hoarding syndrome afflicting a few hundred of our nation's right-wing billionaires has destroyed a large chunk of America's middle class and is threatening the health of our biosphere. But the overall story is larger than that. Trump is embroiled in a bribery scandal that has the entire world agog. The potentates and dictators of the Middle East are openly contemptuous of his willingness to defy Congress and sell them advanced American weapon systems in exchange for billion-dollar Trump hotels in their countries. Putin and his state-owned media ridicules Trump daily, pushing his attacks on Ukraine in Trump's face. And federal workers and our military are aghast at the incompetence, corruption, and even the alleged alcoholism of the people Trump has scraped off the floor of Fox, quote, News, end quote, to run their agencies and make federal prosecutors. All of this corruption and incompetence has one major goal: the enrichment of the Trump family and the people close to them. It's an old story that dates back to the earliest days of human prehistory. There are basically two models for social organization, regardless of all the names. They are me societies and we societies. Russia, for example, is a classic example of a me society. The nation is run by a small cabal of me oligarchs who own or control basically every major company, and in most cases entire industrial, commercial, media, and retail sectors. Each is owned by one or more morbidly rich individuals and their families who are looking out for their own me profits, interests, with little regard for the public good. The country's leader glorifies the individual above society, arguing that governance by hyper-masculine elites, me, willing to use state violence against those advocating democracy and the welfare of the general population, we, is simply the way it's always been. Putin refers to this as Russia's historic greatness. And in that, Putin is right. The majority of post-agricultural revolution history, the past 7,000 or so years, has been a narrative of what Jefferson referred to as the three great tyrannies. Warlord kings, the morbidly rich keeping average people in squalor and ignorance, and violence-enforced theocracies. As he noted in a summary view of the rights of British America in 1774, quote, history has informed us that bodies of men as well as of individuals are susceptible of the spirit of tyranny, end quote. On the other hand, as I lay out in detail in my new book, The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living, the majority of those societies that emerged from tens of thousands of years of trial and error experimentation in governments were, and even today still are, explicitly we societies. The Native American societies that informed and inspired this nation's founders and the framers of the Constitution, for example, considered the accumulation of great wealth, hoarding, to be a dangerous mental illness, right up there with forcible theft, rape, and murder. People who hoarded food or other forms of wealth were disciplined, and if they continued, often banished from the tribe altogether, which could be a functional death sentence, as no other tribes would take such twisted people in. The Algonquin people had a word for this mental illness, as I described in the last hours of Ancient Sunlight. In today's English, it would loosely translate their word, witiko, as greed. The late professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis, Jack Forbes, told me when I was writing Last Hours that witiko literally means cannibal, and Forbes used it quite intentionally to describe European standards of culture. We, quote, eat, end quote, consume other humans by conquering them, seizing their lands, and consuming their life force by enslaving them either physically or economically. For example, the Lakota term wasichu described individuals who hoard resources, literally translating to, quote, he who takes the fat, end quote. The term critiques greed and the accumulation of wealth at the expense of communal well-being. And this was common all over the world. The Batek, an indigenous group in Malaysia, considered sharing food as a moral duty. They believed all food belongs to the forest, and hoarding is socially unacceptable. If someone hoards food, others may take it without it being considered theft. Refusing to share can lead to communal anger and is believed to cause supernatural harm to the refuser. In Aboriginal Australian communities, quote, humbugging, end quote, refers to making excessive demands on family or community resources, often leading to financial abuse. While sharing is a cultural norm, humbugging is viewed negatively and has prompted legal and community responses to protect valuable individuals, especially elders. Yesterday, I noted how so many of America's billionaires are infected with this mental illness, which humanity once found disgusting. Today, we call it, quote, hoarding syndrome, end quote, considered a subset of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, until 2013, when the APA gave it its own specific descriptor in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. Had they been born poor or not gotten a lucky break, they'd be living in apartments with newspapers and empty tin cans stacked floor to ceiling. Instead, they've hoarded wealth beyond the imagination of most people. Estates all around the world, yachts, private jets. There's never, quote, enough, end quote, for them. Society has known about this mental illness forever. Dante, Shakespeare, Gogol, Balzac, and Dickens, for example, all wrote of wealthy characters who disrupted society and the lives of those around them because of their own hoarding disorders. Embracing that indigenous wisdom, many of the idealists who started this country explicitly rejected rule by the rich. None were dynastically wealthy. Not a single one of our founders' wealth lasted beyond a second or third generation, unlike today's billionaires whose families will carry their wealth for centuries to come. Several, like Jefferson and Washington, died in or near bankruptcy. The most outspoken in this regard were Franklin, Payne, Jefferson, and Rush. They were clear that they were trying, within the social limits of their time, to create a, quote, we society, end quote. The Constitution refers to, quote, the general welfare, quote, of Americans twice in the preamble, defining it as one of the basic reasons for the Constitution itself, and one in Article 1, Section 8, describing or defining the powers of Congress to raise taxes and spend money, quote, to provide for the general welfare of the United States, end quote. Over the centuries, the concept of a we society expanded here in America as the voting franchise and individual human rights were expanded and extended beyond wealthy, landowning, straight white men. Progressive Republican President Abraham Lincoln, for example, enthusiastically signed the Morrill Act on July 2, 1862, giving each of the states 90,000 acres of federal land to use to fund and build 76 tuition-free grant colleges so young people could climb out of poverty through free education. My mother's alma mater, Michigan State University, was one of them. But the, quote, me society, end quote, rich of the day kept trying to corrupt politics to their own advantage. In his 1888 State of the Union address, President Grover Cleveland pointed out, quote, we view with pride and satisfaction this bright picture of our country's growth and prosperity, while only a closer scrutiny develops a somber shading. We discover that the fortunes raised by our manufacturers are no longer solely the reward of sturdy industry and enlightened foresight, but that they are largely built on undue exactions from the masses of our people. The gulf between employers and the employed is constantly widening, and classes are rapidly framing, one compromising the very rich and powerful, while another are found the toiling poor, end quote. And what was causing this crisis for America's 19th century working class families? President Cleveland laid it out with a surprisingly blunt vehemence in the next sentences. Quote, as we view the achievements of aggregated capital, we discover the existence of trusts, combinations, and monopolies, while the citizens are struggling far in the rear or is trampled to death beneath the iron heel. Corporations, which should be the carefully restrained creatures of the law and the servants of the people, are fast becoming the people's masters, end quote. The people, and Congress were listening to this critique of the, quote, me society, end quote, that was emerging with the Industrial Revolution. Americans were outraged at the way corporations and the morbidly rich were behaving, and President Cleveland had given voice to their anger. A mere 2 years later, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed, criminalizing monopolies called, quote, trusts, end quote, back then. A short 2 decades later, progressive Republican presidents Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were using the same law to break hoarder John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust into almost 30 pieces. Theodore Roosevelt was clear that he wanted to move America closer to the, quote, we society, end quote, and that he believed the founders envisioned and the times demanded. On August 31st, 1910, he told an audience in Osawatomie, Kansas, quote, the citizens of the United States must effectively control the mighty commercial forces which they have called into being. There can be no effective control of corporations while their political activity remains. To put an end to it will be neither a short nor an easy task, but it can be done, end quote. During Roosevelt's tenure, with widespread public support, states in the U.S. Congress began passing powerful laws to limit the corrupting power of the morbidly rich, quote, me society, end quote, money into politics. In 1905, for example, Wisconsin passed a law, Section 4489A, Section 1, Chapter 292, 1905, that explicitly said, quote, no corporation doing business in this state shall pay or contribute or offer, consent, or agree to pay or contribute, directly or indirectly, any money, property, free service of its officers or employees of anything of value to any political party, organization, committee, or individual for any political purpose whatsoever, and for the purpose of influencing legislation of any kind, or to promote or defeat the candidacy of any person for nomination, appointment, or election to any political office. The penalty included a substantial fine, years in prison for individual executives, lawyers, or lobbyists, and the political death sentence of the corporation itself, i.e. being forbidden from doing business in Wisconsin. 2 years later, efforts to control, quote, me society, and, quote, bad behavior by rich people and corporations went federal with the Tillman Act of 1907. That law explicitly forbade any corporation nationwide from giving any money to politicians. Quote, it is unlawful for any national bank or any corporation organized by authority of any law of Congress to make a contribution or expenditure in connection with any election to any political office, end quote. By 1925, the Tillman Act had been incorporated into the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, further limiting money in politics, and in 1938 we got the Hatch Act, which limited contributions from rich people to $5,000 per candidate and $3 million per party, and it made it an explicit crime for a president to use the White House to hawk commercial property like Teslas, meme coins, or Goya beans. Following the Agnew and Nixon's bribery scandals, we got another bunch of laws to further regulate money in politics, including the 1971 Federal Election Campaign Act and the 1974 creation of the Federal Elections Commission, which then promulgated rules further limiting, quote, dark money, end quote, and other forms of political bribery. These modern efforts to establish a, quote, we society, end quote, had deep roots in Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and largely answer the question about why Congress got to do so much done for average working people. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, minimum wage, OSHA, EPA, right to unionize, etc. between 1933 and 1978. Expanding on the idea of that, quote, we society, end quote, in an August 1912 speech in Chicago, Teddy Roosevelt called for a national minimum wage and government programs for Social Security saying working people shouldn't earn so little that they must steal food and can't provide for their families, deal with illness, or have a safe, comfortable retirement. The fulfillment of his vision came a generation later when his distant cousin, Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, became president and pushed through his New Deal. He legalized unions, passed a minimum wage law, and started Social Security, among other things. Throughout the 1950s, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower expanded all of these, quote, we society, end quote, laws, and added massive national infrastructure projects with huge expenditures on highways, schools, and hospitals that jump-started the post-war economy. In the 1960s, Democratic President Lyndon Johnson added Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, housing supports, and increased support for education. America was not only on the path to becoming a, quote, we society, end quote, we were more than halfway there. By 1980, 2/3 of Americans were solidly in the middle class with a single income, health care was affordable, union membership was widespread, college was free or very inexpensive in most of the country, and the morbidly rich hoarders were kept under control with a 74% income tax bracket. The rest of the world was imitating us back then, as Western Europe in particular expanded on the, quote, we society, end quote, programs of Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, Truman, Ike, JFK, and LBJ. Even little Costa Rica provided health care to all its citizens with a Medicare for All type of program and nearly free college, maximum tuition of $600 a year for anybody who could pass the entrance exams. But then came Ronald Reagan with his neoliberal, quote, me society, end quote, sales pitch that, quote, greed is good, end quote, and the only sure path to national individual prosperity was to free corporations and the morbidly rich from the strictures of taxation and regulation. With Reagan's help, the hoarder syndrome, billionaires, took over politics and began to systematically loot America's economy. In the 44 years since his inauguration, the middle class has shrunk from 2/3 of us down to about 45% of us. And even at that, today, it takes two incomes to match the lifestyle a single income could sustain in 1980. America's richest people, however, have now reached a level of wealth never before seen in the history of the world, not even by kings, pharaohs, or popes. I lay out how Reagan got there in detail in The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, how Reaganism gutted America. But the main event that made the Reagan Revolution and Reagan's neoliberal successors, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, possible was the Supreme Court overturning the Tillman Act and legalizing political bribery in a series of decisions that started in 1976 and peaked when Clarence Thomas cast the tie-breaking vote and the Citizens United in 2010. This betrayal by Republicans on the Supreme Court of America's, quote, we society, end quote, values, described in detail in Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has caused our country to fall far behind most of the rest of the world's advanced democracies. For America to fulfill her promise and become the nation of the majority of our citizens want, voters and Congress must prioritize stripping out of law the Supreme Court invented doctrines of, quote, money is free speech, end quote, and, quote, corporations are persons, end quote. In 2022, Democrats in Congress tried to overcome the power of the, quote, me societies, end quote, legalized big money bribery. The For the People Act passed the House without a single GOP vote, but was killed in the Senate when Manchin and Sinema betrayed Americans by upholding a Republican filibuster. Our job now, if we want America to ever become a, quote, we society that produces the many social and economic benefits of democratic governance, is to get a large enough progressive majority in Congress and a Democrat in the White House so that in 2029 we can actually pull off the revival of a truly democratic America. That means becoming politically active, volunteering to get inside the Democratic Party so you can be a positive change agent, and spreading the good word in anticipation of elections this fall, next year, and beyond. In other words, quote, tag, we're still it, end quote.